The grand hall was filled with cameras, translators, and rows of flags from nations across the globe. It was an international summit that had drawn leaders from east and west, north and south. Reporters whispered about the heavy tension, waiting for the words that would define the future. At the center of it all sat two men whose worlds couldn't be more different: Russian President Vladimir Putin, with his signature cold gaze, and Burkina Faso's young, defiant leader, Ibrahim Traoré, who carried himself with the confidence of someone who had nothing to lose but everything to protect. Putin leaned toward the microphone, his voice low but sharp enough to cut the air. "Africa must tread carefully," he declared, eyes narrowing on Traoré. "History shows that alliances with the wrong partners come at a heavy price. Russia knows strength, and those who oppose it often regret their choices." The room grew silent, even the journalists stopped scribbling in their notepads. Putin's words weren't just aimed at Burkina Faso, they were meant for the entire African continent, a reminder of Russia's weight on the world stage. But Traoré didn't flinch. His jaw tightened, his back straightened, and he leaned forward with a fire in his eyes. He didn't wait for the translators. His words, delivered in flawless English, thundered across the hall. "You warn Africa, Mr. Putin? Africa has lived under warnings for centuries, from empires, from colonizers, from superpowers. And yet we are still here. Stronger. Louder. Unbroken." The silence broke into murmurs, cameras flashing rapidly as if trying to capture the shockwave that had just rippled across the summit. Putin's expression remained unreadable, but a flicker of irritation passed through his eyes. For the first time, someone had turned his own language of power back against him, not with weapons or armies, but with raw, unapologetic defiance. The atmosphere in the summit shifted like a storm rolling over calm seas. Delegates from Europe and Asia exchanged uneasy glances, whispering translations to their leaders. Journalists leaned closer to their cameras, realizing they were witnessing history unfold in real time. Traoré's words hadn't just been a reply, they were a direct challenge to the hierarchy of global power, spoken in the very presence of a man who had built his career on commanding fear. Putin adjusted his posture, the faintest smirk curling on his lips, but his eyes betrayed irritation. He tapped his pen lightly against the table before responding, his tone dripping with condescension. "Young man," he said, voice steady yet cold, "power is not measured by pride or speeches. Power is measured by control, by who commands resources, who commands armies, and who commands respect." He paused, scanning the hall. "And Russia commands all three." For a moment, the silence weighed heavy. But Traoré, unshaken, met Putin's stare without flinching. He leaned forward again, his voice rising with conviction. "Respect," he repeated, the word ringing through the hall. "Respect is not taken, Mr. Putin. Respect is earned. And Africa will no longer trade its dignity for promises of protection or deals written in someone else's language. You speak of armies and resources, but Africa speaks of people. Millions rising, millions refusing to bow. That is power you cannot command." Gasps echoed through the chamber. Some delegates lowered their eyes, unwilling to be caught in the storm between the two leaders. But others, especially from smaller nations long ignored by global superpowers, nodded subtly, their expressions betraying quiet admiration. For them, Traoré wasn't just speaking for Burkina Faso, he was voicing the unspoken frustration of entire continents tired of being pawns. The cameras zoomed in, capturing the contrast, Putin's icy stare against Traoré's blazing determination. Two worlds clashing, one holding on to the old order of dominance, the other daring to declare a new future. The hall erupted into a storm of murmurs. The clash was no longer just words, it had become a symbolic battle between old power and rising defiance. Every camera flash captured the tension, freezing it into history. For years, Africa had been spoken for, lectured, and dismissed. But in that moment, Traoré was no longer a single leader, he was the embodiment of a continent reclaiming its voice. Putin leaned back, his fingers steepled, his tone growing darker. You speak boldly, but boldness does not stop missiles, he said. It does not shield borders. When history is written, it is written by those who win wars, not by those who make speeches. Africa's voice may rise, but against Russia's firepower, it will be silenced. His words carried the weight of threat, wrapped in the cold certainty of someone accustomed to domination. The air thickened. Yet Traoré stood taller, his voice sharper than ever. History, he said, his tone steady but fierce. History is not just written by the victors, Mr. Putin. It is remembered by the people. And what is remembered lasts longer than any empire. You think Africa fears your missiles? No. We have faced chains, guns, and bombs, yet here we stand. What you cannot understand is this: a people who refuse to kneel cannot be erased. Not by wars. Not by empires. Not by you. A thunderous silence followed, heavier than any explosion. Delegates who once avoided confrontation now stared at Traoré with newfound awe. He had not just defied Putin, he had reframed the entire meaning of strength. Strength was not about weapons or armies, it was about unbreakable will. The cameras zoomed in again, framing the moment as if it were destined for history books, Putin's cold glare against Traoré's burning resolve. The world held its breath, realizing that something irreversible had just unfolded. Africa was no longer in the audience of global politics. It was on the stage, demanding its place. The tension in the hall was unbearable. Some leaders shifted in their seats, others stared rigidly at the stage. Putin's gaze did not waver, but a flicker of unease crossed his face, the kind that comes when a man realizes he is not in complete control of the room. He leaned forward, his voice like a low growl. Do not mistake stubbornness for strength, he warned. Defiance without power is only suicide. Africa will learn this, as others have before you. His words were heavy, calculated to crush. Yet they only seemed to ignite Traoré further. The young leader's eyes burned with defiance as he stepped toward the microphone. His voice carried like thunder across the hall. Do not mistake weapons for wisdom, Mr. Putin. And do not mistake fear for respect. Africa is not suicidal, Africa is alive. It has survived centuries of plunder, oppression, and betrayal. And every time men like you predicted its death, it rose again. Stronger. Louder. Unbroken. Gasps rippled through the audience. Some Western delegates looked stunned, while leaders from the global South exchanged glances of pride and solidarity. For them, Traoré was not simply challenging one man, he was dismantling an entire mindset of dominance that had lingered for centuries. Putin straightened, his composure cracking ever so slightly. He responded with icy calm, then you claim survival as victory. But survival is not power. Russia dictates outcomes, not speeches. His tone was surgical, meant to slice away at Traoré's defiance. But Traoré's reply came like a hammer striking steel: power that relies on fear dies with fear. But the will of the people, that is eternal. You may dictate today, but tomorrow belongs to those who dare to stand. And Africa dares. The crowd erupted, some in applause, others in disbelief. Yet one truth was undeniable: in that hall, the balance of moral authority had shifted. Putin had power, but Traoré had something more dangerous: conviction that could not be destroyed. The silence after Traoré's declaration lingered like a storm cloud over the chamber. Putin, who was accustomed to commanding every room he entered, felt a new weight pressing against him. The young African leader had not only refused to bow, he had risen higher. Cameras zoomed in, capturing the hardened lines on Putin's face and the unshakable fire in Traoré's eyes. Around the hall, whispers turned into murmurs, and murmurs into waves of conversation. The tide of the moment was shifting, and everyone could feel it. Putin leaned back slightly, crossing his arms, his cold smirk returning. You speak as if speeches can build nations, Mr. Traoré, he said sharply. But power is forged in the crucible of strength, armies, resources, alliances. You may inspire a crowd, but inspiration cannot shield you from reality. Africa has spirit, yes. But spirit alone does not win wars. His voice was iron, sharpened by decades of political battles. Traoré, however, remained unshaken. He stepped forward, his hand lightly tapping the podium as if grounding himself in the weight of history. "No, Mr. Putin," he answered with precision. "Spirit does not win wars. But it wins freedom. Armies fall. Empires crumble. Weapons rust. Yet the will of the people, that outlives every dictator, every invader, every tyrant. That is why Africa stands today, despite centuries of attempts to break it." The chamber erupted again, but this time with thunderous applause from leaders of developing nations who had long felt silenced. Delegates from Latin America, Asia, and Africa rose to their feet, clapping with a fervor that filled the hall. It was more than applause, it was solidarity. Putin's smirk faltered. He had not expected this chorus of support, nor the way Traoré had turned the room into an echo chamber of resistance. For the first time that evening, the Russian president looked not like the commander of a superpower, but like a man realizing his influence had limits. Traoré let the moment breathe before delivering his final strike. "Africa does not ask for war, but neither will it flee from it. And if war is forced upon us, it will not be Africa that breaks. It will be the arrogance of those who believe Africa can be broken." The hall fell into stunned silence again, punctuated only by the relentless clicking of cameras. The story was already writing itself, headlines that would travel across the world by morning. The air in the chamber grew tense, as if the walls themselves were straining to hold the weight of the confrontation. Putin's eyes narrowed, and his fingers tapped lightly on the table before him. The silence he allowed was calculated, a tactic he had used many times to unsettle adversaries. But Traoré was not unsettled. The young leader stood tall, his posture steady, his presence radiating conviction. Finally, Putin leaned forward, his voice low but cutting. "You speak of spirit, of freedom, as though these ideals can shield you from the storms of power. But let me remind you, power does not bend to ideals. It bends ideals themselves. Nations that defied empires have always ended up in ruins, swallowed by the very fire they tried to resist." His words echoed with the weight of history, spoken like a man who believed his dominance unshakable. Traoré's gaze did not waver. He stepped closer, the light catching the stern determination in his eyes. "You are right, Mr. Putin," he began, his tone calm yet thunderous in its resonance. "History is filled with nations that fell. But history is also filled with empires that collapsed. Do you know why? Because they forgot that power without justice is hollow, and hollow empires eventually crumble under their own weight. Africa will not be the one swallowed, it will be the graveyard of arrogance." The audience gasped audibly at the sharpness of his retort. Delegates shifted in their seats, some nodding, others whispering, but all feeling the gravity of his words. Cameras zoomed in on the scene, the stern Russian president against the resolute African captain. It was more than a debate, it was a collision of eras, of worldviews, of unyielding wills. For the first time, Putin's smirk faded into something else, reflection. Traoré had not come to posture, he had come to declare a new reality. The balance of power was shifting, not through weapons, but through voices refusing silence. Then, raising his hand slightly, Traoré delivered the blow that would echo far beyond the chamber. "Mr. Putin, Africa does not need your permission to breathe. We do not need your consent to rise. And we certainly do not need your blessing to live free. If you see this as defiance, then so be it. Africa will always choose defiance over chains." The hall erupted, some in thunderous applause, others in stunned silence. But no one could deny it, Traoré had shaken the unshakable, the tension in the room thickened, almost tangible, like a storm cloud waiting to unleash its fury. Putin, who had mastered the art of commanding silence, leaned back with his arms crossed, his cold stare fixed on Traoré. Around them, global leaders whispered among themselves, some clearly anxious, others almost thrilled to witness a rare confrontation of such magnitude. Putin finally broke the silence, his voice steady and cutting. "Captain Traoré, your words are bold, but boldness is not strength. Do not mistake the cheers of your people for true power. I command armies, weapons, influence. I have brought nations to their knees without lifting a finger. And you believe Africa, fractured and dependent, can challenge that?" His statement was laced with dismissal, the kind designed to diminish his opponent before the entire world. Traoré did not flinch. His face carried the same firmness that had captivated his people back home. With a slow, deliberate step, he leaned closer to the microphone, his voice rising not in anger but in unwavering conviction. "Mr. Putin," he said, "do you know why Africa stands today? Not because we had the largest armies. Not because we had the most money. But because even after centuries of chains, we refused to surrender our spirit. Your tanks may roll, your bombs may fall, but they cannot crush what has never bowed. You call us fractured? Perhaps. But fractured stones can still break empires when hurled with truth." The audience erupted in murmurs, some gasped at his audacity, others clapped softly, but everyone leaned in closer. The cameras caught every flicker of expression, from Putin's tightened jaw to the unwavering fire in Traoré's eyes. Then Traoré raised his hand, as though to silence the growing chatter, and continued. "You think Africa is still a child, waiting for guidance, waiting for masters. But hear me now, the age of masters is over. We do not fear threats. We do not fear armies. What we fear is silence, and that silence is broken tonight." The room shook with applause, louder this time, unstoppable. Even those who usually stood aligned with Moscow found themselves moved by the raw courage radiating from the young African leader. Putin remained still, but behind his stoic expression, it was clear, Traoré's words had landed with force, harder than any weapon. The air in the hall was electric, as if the walls themselves absorbed the gravity of the exchange. Putin sat unmoving, but his silence carried weight. It was the pause of a man who rarely faced defiance so direct, so fearless. Around the long, polished table, leaders shifted in their seats, some hiding smiles, others whispering behind clasped hands. The cameras zoomed in, capturing the tension, every breath, every glance, as though the world itself demanded to witness this confrontation. Putin finally leaned forward, his hand pressing against the table, his voice low but sharp like the edge of a blade. "Captain Traoré," he said, "you mistake stubbornness for strength. History has shown that those who defy empires are erased. Africa must choose its allies wisely, or it will pay the same price it always has." His words echoed, not only a warning but a declaration, one meant to remind everyone of Russia's reach. Yet Traoré's response came with the calm of a man who had already measured every syllable. He straightened his shoulders, his gaze unwavering, and spoke with a clarity that cut through the murmurs. "You speak of erasure, Mr. Putin," he said. "But do you not see? We have already survived attempts to erase us, centuries of chains, of borders drawn by others, of riches stolen and blood spilled. And still we stand. What you call stubbornness is survival. What you call defiance is freedom. And freedom does not negotiate with threats." The words hung in the air like a hammer striking stone. The applause that followed was hesitant at first, then louder, swelling into a wave that filled the hall. The echo of clapping hands rolled across the chamber, drowning out Putin's silence. For the first time, cameras caught a flicker in Putin's eyes, not fear, not anger, but recognition. He had faced countless adversaries, from presidents to generals, but few had dared speak to him with such unshakable resolve. And yet, here was a man from a nation often dismissed, standing unbowed in front of the world's gaze, reminding everyone that power is not always measured in missiles or money. As the crowd's reaction grew, Traoré raised his voice once more, sealing his message. You say Africa must choose wisely. And we have. We choose ourselves. The chamber exploded in applause, and for a moment, the spotlight belonged not to Putin, but to the young captain who had turned history's gaze back toward Africa. The applause still echoed when the moderator tried to regain control of the session, but it was too late. The world had already decided what it would remember from that day. The camera zoomed in on Traoré, whose calm composure radiated strength. Commentators whispered in headsets, analysts scribbled furious notes, and translators struggled to keep pace with his words as they rippled across languages. Putin leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled, masking his expression behind an unreadable facade. But his silence spoke volumes. He had arrived expecting dominance, expecting the room to bend under his presence. Instead, the spotlight had shifted, illuminating the young African leader who had just transformed the stage into a battlefield of words. Journalists filled social media feeds within seconds. Traoré defies Putin in front of the world. Hashtags surged, clips went viral, and headlines framed the moment as history in the making. Africa was no longer painted as a silent spectator but as a voice that shook the chambers of global power. One delegate leaned toward another and whispered, "Do you see it? This is no longer just about Russia or Africa. This is about every nation that has ever been told to kneel." Across the room, nods of agreement spread like sparks catching fire. Traoré, aware of the weight of the moment, didn't waste it. He raised his hand slightly, commanding silence without force. His words carried clarity, spoken as though he was addressing not just Putin but the billions watching around the globe. "Power," he said, his tone measured, "is not in how loudly you threaten, nor in how many weapons you possess. Power lies in the people who refuse to be broken. Africa is that people. We are not pawns in your games. We are not a prize to be divided. We are the authors of our destiny." The chamber erupted once more, not just with applause but with an energy that felt like a turning tide. Leaders who had kept their heads low began clapping too, some reluctantly, some with genuine conviction. The sound rolled like thunder, refusing to die down. Putin remained still, but his jaw tightened. In that tightening, the world saw what Traoré had accomplished, not victory through war, not submission through fear, but dominance through truth. The cameras captured the moment, freezing it in history, the clash of two leaders, one wielding the weight of an empire, the other carrying the hope of a continent. And in that instant, it was clear who had shaken the world. The chamber was still vibrating with the force of Traoré's words when the final moments of the summit unfolded. Cameras lingered on his face, capturing the unshakable resolve in his eyes. Across the hall, the world's most powerful leaders exchanged uneasy glances, each silently recognizing that something had shifted forever. No one had expected Putin's authority to be challenged so openly. Yet here stood Traoré, not with weapons, not with armies, but with conviction sharper than steel. His voice carried Africa's centuries of struggle, resilience, and hope. And in that moment, the world saw Africa not as a shadow under foreign powers, but as a rising force declaring its independence with thunderous clarity. Reporters rushed out of the chamber, their headlines already forming. Traoré defies Putin on global stage, Africa's voice shakes the Kremlin, new era of power balance begins. The story exploded across screens, and people everywhere replayed the clip that would define the summit. Traoré rose from his seat, his military jacket catching the spotlight as if even the lights bowed to the truth he carried. He spoke one last time, his words crafted not for the leaders in the room but for the billions watching. History does not remember those who submit to fear. History remembers those who stand, even when the world tells them to kneel. Africa has stood today, and we will stand tomorrow. Let this be written not by our enemies, but by our people. As his words echoed, silence fell, the kind of silence that follows a storm when everyone realizes the landscape has been changed forever. Even Putin, cloaked in composure, couldn't mask the weight of what had just happened. And so, the summit ended not with the roar of empires, but with the voice of a young leader who carried the fire of a continent. The world had witnessed a turning point, a reminder that true power lies not in threats, but in the courage to resist them.